Funding for Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff is provided by the Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation. The September 11th surprise attacks on the United States put intense pressure on the American military to respond effectively on many levels. What are the nation's military leaders learning from the war on terror? To find out, Policy Watch is joined by John Barry, Pentagon correspondent with Newsweek magazine. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
John Barry, welcome to the University of Maryland and the University of Maryland School of Public Affairs. We are delighted to have you here.
Good to be with you. Thank you for asking me.
Now, you are the Pentagon correspondent for Newsweek. What's that mean?
It means you go over Niagara every Tuesday morning, basically. The idea of having, a correspondent who covers what is now a $400 billion defense budget is, of course, grotesque.
There's only one of you?
There is one of me full-time. We have another couple of people who pretend to do it part-time. Only journalists would have the chutzpah to say, I cover the Pentagon. But the truth of the matter is I've done it now since 1985. When Newsweek asked me to do it, I said, well, I'll do it for a couple of years, and then one more year. And it is like covering a town, a small town. It is 17 miles of corridor and about 25,000 people, most of them pretty smart, and a series of problems that never go away, which is what do you do about national security in a changing world? The big change in my lifetime, of course, was the ending of the Cold War, which I had not thought to see. And so I was hired by Newsweek because I was an expert on the Warsaw Pact and on the Soviet Union. And so I had to press a button like dump and get rid of all of that and start again like everybody else in the national security business. So that's what I've been doing since 1989-90.
Well, you called the Pentagon a village. How much has it changed since September 11th, 2001?
It's changed enormously because it conceives itself to be at war. There is a permanent state of war. America is at war. And that's rhetoric for most people, because for most people, the war on terror remains an abstraction, except when they go through airport lines, when it's just irritating. Or unless you're a member of the National Guard and Reserve, in which case your life has been thoroughly screwed up ever since then. But for most of us, it remains an abstraction, but not in the Pentagon. People work on this and think about this, and it's an impressive place.
Does the fact that the Pentagon itself was a target have something to do with their feelings?
Yes. It brings it home and personal. I was in the building, not in that part of it. I was in another wing. And it was unforgettable.
Could I ask you to talk about it a little bit?
We'd all seen on television the shots of the World Trade Center. And then there was this shuddering went through the building. And it was very odd. It was a sound as I'd never heard before. Someone said of watching their first hydrogen bomb test, I think, that the sound was like some huge door slamming below the earth. And this was a sound, the deepest sound I'd ever heard. And then lights went out. And then it became clear that there was smoke. And it became clear what had happened. It was a very strange sensation.
Was there panic or fright?
Fright, not panic. It was quite impressive. I mean, most of the people in the Pentagon are civilians, and they hadn't been prepared for what happened. And of course there hadn't been proper evacuation drills. No, of course there hadn't. So everyone was scrambling their way to the exits and so on. But everyone behaved well. There was a curious feeling of validation. I mean, it was as if they were quite glad that they'd been struck. In other words, it wasn't just a civilian target. This was the heart of American military power. And, okay, they're taking us on. I mean, even then there was that sense of it. And then we all gathered at a gas station across a couple of the freeways that go past the Pentagon. And then we went back into the building late that evening, and it was dark and charred, and it smelled like there'd been a fire. We mourned those who died. Everyone in the building knew people who died. I knew people in the army who died. But there was a sense of, yes, now we know we're at war. This is personal. And it hasn't changed since then.
I'm always struck when I watch the interviews with soldiers over either in Afghanistan or in Iraq. They tend to say, we're here to fight the war on terrorism over here, so we don't fight it in America. Before getting to whether that's true or not, we'll talk about. Is that part of this?
Young American soldiers, and I've seen, God knows how many, are remarkable. I mean, they're of average intelligence. There aren't very many, young guys or young girls who are completely brilliant out there, but they're of average intelligence. They're going to be good citizens. They care desperately that they do well. They're extremely well trained. And they are, they're classic, marvelous middle American products. Really extraordinary. And as long as they're well trained and as long as they're well led, then they do very well indeed. If the training goes or the leadership goes, then it's a screw up and a mess. But the military therefore spends an enormous amount of its energies. And it's hard for people to understand that who are outside the military machine. The military spends most of its time and effort sort of thinking about itself. The military is an amazingly introspective organization because the hardest thing to do is to run itself, which is why, we have a very large Pentagon budget, but if you then ask the Pentagon to go to war, they ask for extra money because wars are extra. And the reason is that it is so difficult to run these large organizations, and they are huge in the American military. I mean, they're not huge in the scale of things. They're not huge. It turns out the Army is probably not large enough to do the set of tasks that we've given it for the war on terror, which we'll go into. But they are barely almost done as a huge organization. And the most difficult single thing is to continue to run it and train it and motivate it and make sure that every kid there knows what they're supposed to do. So most of the military's energies goes on itself. And this is, again, a very hard thing to persuade people outside the Pentagon of, but it's true.
My sense is that this has changed from the defining war for my generation, the war in Vietnam, because this is a professional army. This is an army that doesn't rotate in and out.
Yep.
Is that part of this? I mean, when they say a professional army, they mean an army that's been trained and retrained and trained again. Is that part of it?
Yes, it is. What we're trying to do with the American military is to do what nobody else in history has ever done, which is to have a professional, middle-class, married military. And my own sense is that we are now stressing the system sufficiently that we're going to see if the experiment's going to work, because we haven't stressed it before. Let me give you a simple statistic. We depend very heavily upon the National Guard and Reserve. Okay. On the whole, the National Guard and Reserve through the 80s served, the metric is how many million man days of their lives do you take each year for service. And on the whole through the 80s, we took about 1 million man days a year. Okay? The first big spike was Desert Storm, and we took, over the 18-month period, we took about 30 million man days for Desert Storm, Desert Shield, Desert Storm. Okay? And then it settled down through the 90s. We took about, sort of by the late 90s, we were taking about 13 million man days of reservists' time a year. We were pulling them out of the community, pulling them out of their jobs, their homes, whatever, and using them for military purposes. This last year, the final stats are not in, but a friend of mine told me, up to September 30th, end of the fiscal year, we used them last year for 62 million man days. Now, we're stressing the system to the point it's going to break, in my view. And my sense is that the war on terror, quote unquote, if we continue to fight it in the way we're doing, is going to demand some rethinking, both of the size and the structure of the American military.
Some rethinking. Which direction? A larger standing army or a change in the rules for the reserve?
The The problem with a larger standing army is that it's very expensive for what you get out of it. The reason being that the reason why the professional army, the standing army, is very good is that it trains a lot, and we educate it. We send the soldiers through an insane number of courses. Okay, that means that if actually the ratio of active to total is about 1 in 5. That is, for every soldier you have at the front, you've probably got another 4 doing other things back home. And if you shrink it, and you can in times of crisis shrink it down to sort of 1 in 3. I mean, in times of major crisis, you send everybody, but you can get it down to sort of 1 in 3 if you want to. But 1 in 5 is certainly for the Army, also for the Air Force, a bit less for the Navy. I think, of operating ratio. So if you want to add 10,000 active duty soldiers to the force, you probably have to add 50,000. So adding to the active force is a very inefficient way of doing it. Therefore, what they're thinking of is moving towards different contracts of service which meld time in the active with time in the reserves. So you go in the active, then you need to have a family, so you take a few years out, then you come back into the active again, but in your years out, you go into the reserves. In other words, they're trying to rethink David Chu, who's the personnel guy at the Pentagon, who was at RAND before that, and then the Pentagon in a previous incarnation before that. So he's a smart guy, he's thought about this for years. I mean, they are trying to figure out, he's trying to figure out new ways of aligning military service with civilian life. That seems to be the way to go.
The Army's at stress now, and we may or may not have enough people. I listen to our political leaders,
right,
and at least most of the Republicans, John McCain accepted,
sure,
say we have enough men over there, men and women. The Democrats seem to hedge. They seem to say, well, we have the wrong people, the wrong mix, and so forth. And sometimes an extra division is talked about. You follow this. What do the people in the Pentagon say? And what's your sense of what we need over there?
Iraq is a mess.
All over, or central Iraq?
It's not a mess all over, but it's going to get a mess all over unless we're very careful.
How so?
Because of a collision of two things, I think. The first was that we, and by this I mean the administration, had absurdly optimistic views of how the bulk of the Iraqi people were going to view American troops coming in. Okay? Vice President Cheney, reflected the general view when he said we're going to be greeted as liberators, and all of which was true. But the problem was that the administration then intellectually elided that, and I'm using administration in its loosest sense. I mean, the small group who were thinking about it, we can go into that later if you want, but those who were thinking about it sort of elided greeting troops as liberators, i.e., thank heavens Saddam has gone, with accepting the troops as occupiers. And the truth is that those two are entirely separate propositions. And we have done a rotten job of being occupiers. And the second reason, which relates to the first, is that Rumsfeld, the defense secretary, was concerned that Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, should be a showcase for a transformed military. Okay? So instead of a 6-month build-up and 500,000 troops, most of which weren't needed, which is what happened in Desert Storm 11 years ago, what happened was that he browbeat Tommy Franks, the general, who was in command, central command at that time, into essentially going with a bare-bones force and relying upon speed and relying upon air power to provide artillery for the relatively light infantry that then speared north. Okay? It worked. It was a stunning success. It was an absolutely brilliant campaign. The risks they took were quite hair-raising, but fortunately the Iraqis were amazingly incompetent, so it worked.
Were the Iraqis incompetent, or did many of them want to surrender?
The regular army wanted to surrender. The Republican Guard didn't. And indeed, bits of the Republican Guard fought very well indeed. And part of the large numbers of the irregular forces called the Fedayeen, who were run by one of Saddam's sons, were in fact extremely brave, I mean suicidally brave, but fortunately very badly trained and equipped. They had pickup trucks of the kind we saw in Mogadishu, where we call them technicals, pickup trucks with sort of heavy caliber machine guns mounted on the cab, and they would basically charge American armored group, which was not a sensible thing to do, and so they lost large numbers, but they were very brave and very determined. The Republican Guard were equally determined, but what happened was that the theory of blitzkrieg warfare worked, and the U.S. forces were simply way beyond, in geographical terms, were just far more advanced than any of the Iraqi command structure could cope with. So it was an astonishing blitzkrieg achievement. The problem was that having got with a bare bones force to Baghdad, and having bypassed all of the cities en route deliberately, when the place fell apart, we simply didn't have enough troops to do anything about the total social collapse that then occurred. Mm-hmm. And one of the big mysteries, which I spent some time and effort to no avail trying to find the answer to, is why didn't we fly in further light infantry immediately after the victory? And I cannot get a straight answer, and you'll be amazed that people have asked that, but I mean, you simply cannot get a straight answer to that. And it's made even odder by the fact that in planning before the war, Jay Garner, who was the retired three-star, who had been asked to run the reconstruction organization, was not a fool. One of the things he said to people every Wednesday afternoon when he used to go into the NSC to meet Condi Rice, the National Security Advisor, one of the things he said was, we're going to need a Caribbean area force almost immediately as an occupying force. And everyone, Condi and everybody, would say, yes, we do. What a good idea. And he'd say, well, yes. And Condi would say, according to my source, well, the UN are going to provide that. But of course the UN didn't. And so the occupation/liberation got off to a catastrophically bad start. And in a sense, we've been trying to recover from that ever since.
Did she and the administration, assuming that she was the decision maker, just so misjudge what the French and the Germans were prepared to do? And it is the French and the Germans when you say the UN, isn't it?
It's more than that, but French and Germans, particularly the French. Yes, I think so. They misjudged the. I think. We have to wait for the memoirs to see this, but I mean, my sense is that they misjudged the difficulty of running Iraq. Okay, they were persuaded by the exiles that, and also I have to say by a good number of quote-unquote Middle East experts around this town, that what would happen was that they could do essentially a decapitation strike and get rid of a small group of bad guys at the top, starting with Saddam, but then his sons, and then the senior Baathists, but the rest of this bureaucracy would sort of continue to function. And of course that didn't happen. The bureaucracy collapsed and vanished, and the ministries were looted to the point where telephone wires were pulled out of walls and anything with copper was pulled out and sold. So they were faced with anarchy where they had expected to be taking over a functioning society. That was the first point. And the second, I think, was that in terms of who was going to police this, they did think that once they, that is the US, had pulled off this victory, that everyone in the UN would say, oh, well, bygones are bygones, let's now all rally around. And in fact, that didn't happen. The anger at President Bush runs too deep, in my view.
Was it just the anger, or did we not sweeten the pie enough?
No, I think it was.
Be direct about it.
I think it was anger. There is a lot of talk that it was oil contracts were the key to this and so on. I spent, and some of us spent some time looking at this, and I don't believe that's true. First, because the other countries didn't have some of the oil contracts that we say they had. I mean, they had memoranda of understanding, but it was no more than that. And secondly, because everyone knew that once Saddam had fallen, all bets were off. So I don't think it was to do with preserving or not preserving oil contracts. It was simply that by this point, the Europeans were really sufficiently pissed off with this administration, to put it bluntly, that it was, you've made your bed, now lie in it, fellas, and enjoy it.
Now, I may be speaking like an American here.
Right. Feel free.
We'll get to where you come from in a minute. But that does sound a little bit like I'll cut my nose off to spite you.
Yep.
Because if this goes sour, this doesn't just go sour for New York and San Francisco and LA. Am I right about that?
You're making a connection there between what happens in Iraq and terrorism, which I'm not sure I would accept. So let's disentangle that.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
If you say, if it goes sour in Iraq, are there consequences throughout the Middle East? And the answer is I would accept that. As far as I can tell, the European view, and I know the French view better than I know the German view, the French view is that the US has made such a commitment that the US is not going to let it go sour. I mean, the French have this, we're into the business of wild generalizations here, but I mean, the French have this strange view about American power, which is on the one hand they resent it, and on the other hand they exaggerate its puissance. So the French really do think that America can solve Iraq and cope. Okay, it infuriates the hell out of them, but I mean they really think it can. And so the French view is that President Bush and the Americans have made such a commitment in Iraq that they're going to fix it. So any European troops that go in, a mere window dressing, they're not necessary. America will fix it. And so when Colin Powell says at the last NATO meeting, for instance, we would really like help from NATO, the French were the most skeptical and said, why? I mean, genuinely puzzled. Because they couldn't actually believe that America really did need European help, which America, in fact, does, simply in terms of manpower. So you have this very strange attitude.
Many of us feel quite blessed, lucky, whatever, protected.
Sure.
That nothing has happened since September 11th in this country. Why haven't we seen more, do you suppose, in this country? Why haven't we seen another September 11th or a smaller version of that here?
I think that there is reasonably good evidence, some of which I know and much of which I don't, that there was an effort to get, first of all, another plane on 9/11. I mean, there was a plan to hijack another plane on 9/11. That aborted. Secondly, there was then a plan by Al-Qaeda.
Were those the people going down to Texas or whatever?
Yes,
that's right. People?
That's right. Then there is, I gather, good evidence that there was a plan to have some sort of set of follow-up attacks on the West Coast, focusing on Los Angeles Airport and a couple of other targets around the Bay Area. There's talk of trying to take out the Golden Gate Bridge, for instance, that kind of thing. And what happened to those people is unclear to me. I suspect some are in Guantanamo. Others seem to have fled either north or south, or just got on planes and got away. But I think that since then, what's happened has really been a really pretty significant counterintelligence effort in this country, which I do think seems to have essentially disrupted whatever organization there was. I then make the further point that I think it's very easy to exaggerate the competence and organizational skill of Al-Qaeda, which I think we've done. Al-Qaeda is a loose confederation of groups, none of them particularly competent, where there appear to be a handful of people who are at the center, who are really pretty smart and pretty good and know how to organize these things. Zawahiri, for instance, appears to be really very smart. There is a serious theory, which I think has a lot of evidence behind it, to the effect that he's actually the organizational brain, whereas bin Laden is the sort of the inspirational figure, if you like. And however, the number of people who can organize a really coherent conspiracy to hijack X number of planes at X airports, to have practices beforehand, and to get it all right. First of all, that's a very difficult thing to do, thank heavens. And secondly, the ability to organize it is relatively limited. Certainly when you add then the complications of having to organize secret money channels, secret communication channels, it becomes a very complicated operation. And there are very few people who can do that. Certainly very few people who can do it under the really fairly baleful gaze at this point of an alerted US FBI and CIA and intelligence organization. So my guess is that what's happened is that the US has turned itself into a pretty difficult target for those sorts of operations, which is why they're looking to places like East Africa. To give you an example, the reason why British Airways cancelled flights to and from Nairobi a couple of months back was not, as was put out at the time, that there was a fear that they were going to be shot down by a shoulder-fired missile. What happened was that the Americans and the Brits together found that there was evidence from passenger records that some people who were flying on different names but appeared to be the same people on different flights, looked as if they were taking dry run practice flights. Okay, and so there was an argument, and the Americans wanted to let these dry run flights continue while they sorted out where these people were and so on. The target was, I gather, the American embassy in Nairobi. They were going to run a plane in straight off the airport. But British Airways got cold feet and said, don't think we want to risk it, so they shut down the flights to the CIA's fury. So there are efforts like that going on, but they're against what you called earlier soft targets. Indonesia couldn't be a softer target. I mean, you can hit anything you want in Indonesia, just take in a suitcase. So you're going to see more of that, I think. But the U.S. has been quite effective.
Well, John, thank you very much for coming to the University of Maryland and the School of Public Affairs. And see you soon, I hope. Thank you.
Funding for Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff is provided by the Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation.
We are PBS.